We all know that plastic waste is a huge problem right now. It doesn't degrade on any decent timescale anyway. It's filling up the oceans and the waterways and littering every free space in every country, however remote they may be. But we've had the comfort of knowing that although it wasn't easy, although it took time, more and more plastic has been made recyclable. After all, much of the plastic we use has that three arrows symbol that we know means that it can be added to the recycling bin and turned thereby into a new plastic product or something equally worthwhile. Except that a recent report says all of that is completely wrong, that the plastics industry has always known that it's completely wrong and they have been playing us all for fools. Why? So it could carry on without lawmakers realising that more drastic plastic laws would be required. That's what the report says. But is it true? And what's the implication for the future? Well, let's have a look. So here's the case being made by the Centre for Climate Integrity, which produced this report, the uncompromisingly titled The Fraud of Plastic Recycling. How big oil and the plastics industry deceived the public for decades and caused the plastic waste crisis. So what's the case? It argues that most people understand recycling as the ability for materials to be processed and then turned into entirely new products. And although there may be a limit to the number of times that a material can be recycled, it would nevertheless be a number of times. Plastic, however, is different. In spite of all the talk in recent decades about plastics recycling, the brutal truth is that the vast majority cannot be recycled in that sense. Viable end markets for recyclables only exist for polyethylene terephthalate and high-density polyethylene containers. That's not news. The US Environmental Protection Agency has documented this for decades. But, you say, my local council collects all manner of plastics, everything that has one of those recycling symbols on them. Well, the report says, rather a lot of them are just burned for energy. Failing that, they end up in landfills, out of sight, out of mind. Even when you have the same types of plastic, they often can't be recycled together because of chemical additives or colouring. And even where recycling happens, it degrades the quality so much it can only be done once, and that one time costs more money than simply producing brand new plastic from fossil fuels. So there's not much commercial incentive to even do it. Practically, they say, plastics are recycled by being burned for energy, which is polluting and is a lot less useful than proper recycling would be. The fact that most people wouldn't recognise it as recycling at all has not been a problem because basically no one's been much talking about it. They just presume that plastic is being properly recycled. Why is it that so many people have the wrong idea about what happens to plastic then? Well, according to the report, not by accident. The industry began feeling the heat of the backlash against landfilling in the 1980s, so it pivoted to promote recycling. The report says this: for decades, petrochemical companies and the plastics industry have known of the technical and economic limitations that make plastics unrecyclable and have failed to overcome them. Despite this knowledge, the plastics industry has continued to increase plastic production while carrying out a well-coordinated campaign to deceive consumers, policymakers, and regulators about plastic recycling. There are two statements there. The first is the argument that plastics cannot, and the implication is realistically can never be, recycled effectively. That's a statement, may or may not be true. The wholly separate statement is that the industry as a whole knew that it was not now, and probably not ever, likely to be effective. and deliberately misled wider society in order to protect its own short-term needs. That is a more contentious claim because you need very good evidence of intent, none of us being mind readers, by the way. What campaign groups often take as evidence of intent, often cherry-picked presentations or phrases lifted from a mountain of other material, it's not always as strong as they think it is. Now, sometimes it is. I mean, the detail matters. So let's start with some figures. Reportedly, around 9% of the world's annual haul of plastic is successfully recycled. 9%. Many companies have signed up to using recycled plastic in their products, so there is a market. You might think 9% is still a rather small percentage. What are the ambitions to improve that figure? Well, the European Union is one of the more aggressive on environmental policy. Under the European Strategy for Plastics in the Circular Economy, they have set a target that 10 million tonnes of recycled plastic should be used in new products by 2025, which is next year. Something like 26 million tonnes of waste is generated, so that's a bit more of a respectable percentage if the target is actually met by next year. EU regulations promising a thing and EU regulations delivering a thing are famously, well, not the same thing. We heard about the row caused by the European Commission deciding that a plastic bottle carrying a label saying 100% recycled plastic, which, I don't know about you, but I would presume meant that all the plastic in that bottle was recycled, as in 100%. But apparently it turns out no. A recent document obtained by the website Politico revealed that the EU executive has been swayed to a more lax approach championed by, yes, the dastardly plastics and chemicals industries. This would allow companies to collect recycling credits for different products across their range and accumulate them into the labelling of one product. In other words, suppose you had 5 products and you used 20% recycled plastic in all of them. You could add those 20% together and then add the label to one of those products that it is 100% recycled plastic. Technically, you're describing the right quantity of recycled material, but it's not strictly true that the object you're holding was made of all recycled plastic. And this is the point. Chemical recycling processes for plastic require a mix of virgin and recycled plastic. Giving consumers a plastic bottle that declares itself to be 100% recycled incorrectly conveys the impression to the public that 100% recycling is possible. The European Commission had warned that too restrictive a rule set might mean that chemical recyclers would be likely to refrain from planned investments which could stall the development of plastic recycling processes for the future in total. That seems like a significantly unimpressive argument, it seems to me. Any process that can't openly declare itself is one that is highly risky anyway, because the truth will out at some point. But the Commission has set ambitious recycling targets, and it wants to be able to boast that it has met them, because, politicians. So the industry and the lawmakers have a shared vested interest that potentially leads them to spin the benefits. Being seen to tackle the problem is more valuable than actually tackling the problem, at least until you get found out. As the Commission noted in a document made public last year, if chemical recycling calculations are too flexible, traceability of recycled content becomes more complex, and confidence in recycled content claims and in the recycling of plastics could be undermined. Processes that can be undermined by the truth? Well, maybe they should be. So what's the case in this report that the industry has behaved so badly? It begins by tracking attitudes through history. And the fact is that between the 1950s to the 1970s, everyone in society, pretty much, was completely okay with the idea that you use a thing and then you threw it away. There was loads of space for landfill sites after all, and we suddenly had lots of stuff that we hadn't had through the war and the rationing. We now wonder if that's a bad thing, but at that specific period it seemed like a great thing, a real sign of progress and prosperity. Everyone was happy with it. It's important to state that, because of course the campaigners are inclined to look back on history and see culpability from the industry for having those attitudes as though they were the only ones that had them and as though somehow they caused them. But they didn't really. They produced amazing new materials that had lots of useful applications, hence the materials became in high demand, so the companies produced more of them for us. And the idea that the waste could become a big problem, yeah, well, that was a tomorrow problem. Politicians, business leaders, and frankly the rest of us combined, generally put off worrying about tomorrow problems until tomorrow, since we usually have plenty of today problems to deal with. By the mid-1980s, however, landfill waste and plastic waste was becoming more ubiquitous and a lot more visible, so it was becoming a today problem. The industry was coming under increasing pressure to do something, but it was bumping up against the reality that recycling this stuff just wasn't very easy to do, thanks to all the various additives that gave specific properties, all the different polymers used for all the different plastics types. This is the point where the argument is made that abuses really took place. The industry was clear that incineration, where plastic would be burned for its energy content, remained the best solution of a bad bunch of solutions. But that position changed in the 1980s. According to the report, which says this, what led the industry to change its position in the 1980s was not a massive technological breakthrough or an answer to the economic roadblocks to plastic recycling. Rather, the plastics industry began to lie about the viability of recycling as a direct result of the backlash they faced from the public. One document quoted as evidence of this was an internal memo of the Society of the Plastics Industry, which was talking about the threat that the state of New Jersey specifically might start to crack down. The SBI had done its lobbying duty, the memo noted. While we were able to deflect some harsh, restrictive language singling out plastic as a difficult material to collect and recycle, there is no question that the state of New Jersey must see substantial short-term progress in the recycling of plastic containers, or else punitive legislation with full backing of the state will attack the problem head-on. Early bills, such as a 1988 one to ban polystyrene and PVC food packaging in Suffolk County, New York, were also seen as a foreshadow of what might inevitably follow. The industry had to visibly be seen to recycle, or it might be banned. So, new trade associations and front groups sprang up for what the report describes as the plastics industry began a coordinated campaign to sell the promise of recycling. Now the question is this: was it to sell the promise while having no intention of ever delivering the reality? Or was it about just buying time to deliver the reality by not having politicians lurch to early conclusions that everything should be banned? Bear in mind that in any scenario, you will get some people bought into the plan and others who are naysayers arguing that it can't be done within the industry bodies themselves. You'll get some cynics arguing to go through the motions only, others who think bigger and better. The temptation is always to take the evidence of the naysayers as expressing the secret consensus, whereas we may not know, they might have been outliers. The report says this: the largest resin producers, including Exxon, Mobil, DuPont and Dow, invested tens of millions of dollars into various aspects of plastic recycling, including public relations efforts to shape consumer perception of recycling. The report is mostly interested with the latter, the PR campaign, although the substance of the former, various aspects of recycling, seems to me to be rather relevant to the question. One aspect they seize on is the way that a labelling system was introduced to identify types of plastics present. Resin identification codes, originally known as the Voluntary Plastic Container Coding System. At least some recyclers said that they didn't need such a system. But what was noted by the critics was that the codes, used with the distinctive recycling symbol, also sent a message to consumers. Namely that the plastics containers were either made of recycled material or they were themselves recyclable. But the fact that the technology existed to recycle a particular container didn't necessarily mean it was economically viable. Were these actions, amongst others, cynical, or were they just overambitious, hard-to-achieve promises? The report quotes a presentation given by James Law of DuPont at an industry conference in 1992 where he said this: "It is no secret that the quantitative goals industry originally set for itself on economically recycling plastic containers extracted from municipal waste streams were extremely ambitious. There were, however, valid reasons for adopting these stretch goals." Now, businesses set themselves stretch goals all the time. It's an argument that if you set targets too low, you fail to make the progress you might have made if you were more ambitious and set your sights higher. Against that, you always have to weigh the perception that you fail if you don't meet those stretch targets. The fact that he added the comment, "The goals have proven to be an even greater stretch than originally anticipated," does suggest that when the goal was set, it was assumed by those setting it that it would be possible to achieve. Now, that's not how the campaigners see it, at least the ones who wrote this report. But it seems a reasonably obvious interpretation. Anyway, by the mid-1990s, the plastics industry group's PR and advertising campaign seemed to have been effective. Roger King, a columnist in the magazine Plastics News, declared this: "The plastics recycling war is over. We should declare victory and put the money into cancer research. America has a curbside plastics recycling infrastructure in place that includes more than 7,000 communities. With these sophisticated programs, the level of plastics recycling is about 22%. And won't increase greatly for each new dollar spent." The article noted that a number of state governments across the US had been introducing charges against plastic objects, but that the revenues raised was often going into general coffers, not into funding increases in plastics recycling, as people tended to presume. And such measures were getting some deserved pushback from taxpayers when they realised the truth, because eventually the truth will out. The plastics industry spent $18 million on advertising over a single 9-month stretch in 1992 to 1993. Data showed that public favourability about plastics increased 12% between 92 and 97, with a particular boost during that period of high advertising. Now, there's no reason per se to begrudge an industry wanting to improve its public image. But the report writers are most exercised by how they influence the perception about the value of plastics recycling per se. Surveys of consumers, media members, government officials, even waste management industry representatives believed that plastic could be economically recycled at a much higher rate than it actually could be in reality. Something that only began to change around 2015, when stories about microplastics in the environment and in food and in beverages and documentaries showing ocean plastic waste started to provoke a much stronger backlash. China decided to stop allowing the flow of plastic waste from the West into its country, an interruption that soon created a widespread sense of an impending crisis. Well, problems that are ignored generally get worse rather than just going away. Something to bear in mind for the future, perhaps. In recent years, many more places have banned types of plastic objects or containers and have been much more punitive about when the material can or cannot be used. And yet, used it still is. The thing that environmental campaigners often fail to acknowledge or seek to resolve is that plastics are widely used in our society because, actually, in many applications, they are really, really useful. They have unique properties. They can be used at a very wide range of temperatures. They're chemical resistant, they're light resistant, they're strong, they're tough, but can easily be worked and moulded as a hot melt. And of course, in addition to all of that, they're cheap. While that doesn't make the downside go away, and that downside is a major challenge, their preferred solution of simply wishing all the plastic away has a lot more negative consequences than they think. And so, while they may be able to ignore them, for people who use plastic so that food lasts longer on the shelf, for example, well, they can't ignore them. And if they did, we would slightly reduce one problem while creating a whole new one, significantly in increased food waste. Hence why a number of governments, corporations and others have been recognising that the technology of plastics recycling still has progress to be made, but are seeing that as a challenge to be solved rather than a towel to be thrown in. And they see the plastics companies mostly recognising that this is a hurdle that they do have to overcome, so are genuinely being keen to work on it. Existential challenges are very motivating once you're not allowed to ignore them anymore anyway. You have the business membership organisation, the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, looking at developing standardised methodologies for companies to track plastics and prevent them entering waterways. You have the Plastics Europe trade body commissioning reports into all the options of how the plastics production process can be changed to reduce emissions and waste. You have the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, a partnership including a lot of the major companies, highlighting 27 actions and policies to reduce waste and increase recycling. Do any of those mean that the problems have been solved? Of course they don't. But the question is whether it can be seen as a solvable problem. Companies are prone to can-do optimism when it comes to solving problems. It's rather what they see as their main differentiator in terms of organisational skills and why they are apt to be successful in marketplaces. For now, you have a business coalition for a global plastics treaty, including a number of big companies known for their ambition when it comes to sustainability, such as Unilever and Nestle, and they say specifically this: our vision is a circular economy in which plastic never becomes waste or pollution, and the value of products and materials is retained in the economy. It admits the size of the challenge. Currently, most plastics are not designed for a circular economy, nor are they circulated in practice. Yet the best available scientific analysis shows us that known circular economy solutions, if applied at scale, can reduce annual volumes of plastic pollution by at least 80% by 2040 compared to business as usual, and achieve near zero plastic pollution by 2060 globally. That would be one of those stretch targets. But is it as unrealistic a one as the historical example we already looked at? Is it being pushed cynically, or is it going with serious intent? After all, we're now in the age where technology, AI and other innovations are solving all sorts of problems. Surely it can't be that we can design artificial intelligence, we can maybe send humans to Mars, but we can't recycle a plastic spoon? The campaigners have no doubt it's just more of the same. They say this: for decades, petrochemical companies and the plastics industry have known of the technical and economic limitations that makes plastics unrecyclable and have failed to overcome them. Despite this knowledge, the plastics industry has continued to increase plastic production while carrying out a well-coordinated campaign to deceive consumers, policymakers, and regulators about plastics recycling. Really, all this relatively recent report is about is this: can we hold the plastics industry historically culpable in the way that we did for tobacco companies and other campaigners are trying to do at the moment to fossil fuel companies? The blame game, used as a device to accelerate towards a future where plastic is simply not produced, whatever may be the consequences. That is also, you might suggest, something of a stretch target. So the question is, do we think the problem of plastic waste is solvable, and that means it will continue to have a place as a highly useful product for our consumer society? Or is that beyond us, and we will simply have to find another way? I don't know, I just asked a question. Realistically, it will only get answered at the point where it ends up in court, because that's the world that we now live in.